Hello and good afternoon. On behalf of HP, thank you for joining this webinar on the future of work with HP and Forrester Research Incorporated. I'm pleased to introduce our presenters today who are eager to share the trends they are seeing in the future of the office. We have a special guest, Andrew Hewitt, who is an analyst with Forrester Research Incorporated. We also have Loretta Li-Sevilla, a Senior Director of Office of the Future, Business Incubators and Collaboration Business for HP's Commercial PCs. So let's get started. Andrew, the time is now yours.
Awesome. Thank you, Abby. And I can't say how happy I am to be here talking about one of my favorite topics, which is the future of work. And as Abby mentioned, my name's Andrew Hewitt. I've been at Forrester now for 6 years, and I'm our lead analyst covering end-user computing, management and security of end-user computing, as well as remote work, which, as you can imagine, has been a major topic of interest for Forrester's clients. And the title of our webinar today is The Future of Work is Already Here. And personally, I could not agree more that that is the case. And from our research, we've seen that the pandemic has really catapulted enterprises into the future of work, whether that's flexible work, whether that's evolutions in end-user computing, whether that's a modernization of your security strategy with zero trust. The future of work really is here. It's now. And today, Loretta and I are going to spend some time talking about how you can manage that change so that you and your business can be successful as possible in this new future of work. But first, I just want to take some time just to briefly walk through our agenda today. We have prepared 3 sections. One is the 4 shocks impacting the future of work, which is hint broader than just COVID-19 pandemic, where we are now in this massive change, as well as the future of work in the new normal. And you'll see a lot of stats from both myself and Loretta. What we'll be kind of, trading back and forth in terms of, delivering, some of the insights from both Forrester and HP. So let's start just first with the 4 shocks that are impacting the future of work. Now, at Forrester, we have identified 4 major shocks as part of this future. But I think right now, the thing that people are really thinking about the most is COVID-19 and what impact will that have on enterprises going forward. And we did something at the beginning of March when all of this started to, come to fruition. And we started to see that, from our surveys that we were doing, we did what was called our Pandemic EX survey. So we went out and we did a multi-wave, multi-country survey of employees just to get their perception on, how is COVID-19 impacting your experience at work? And we asked them this question: if you had to make the best guess at how long it will be before things start to return to normal, how long will that be? Now, most people that we surveyed here believed it would last longer than 3 months. And right now, it's July 22nd. We're coming towards the end of that 3 months. But given that cases are rising pretty substantially, depending on where you are in the world, and particularly in the United States at this moment, it's clear that the 60% of people approximately who said that it was going to be shorter than 3 months were very much wrong in terms of that long-term outlook of the pandemic. I think we simply don't know how long this is going to last, and neither do a lot of the businesses that I've been working with, which has prompted this massive move to remote work. It's prompted a rethink in technology strategy, as well as kind of a renaissance around the relationship between corporate culture, employee experience, and technology, which is what we're going to be focusing on a lot in today's discussion. It's important, though, to realize that this pandemic is really part of a broader shock that enterprises are starting to go through. And we've identified 4 shocks that are part of this future of work. And COVID-19 is part of this first shock, which we call systemic risk. So systemic risks are basically all the factors that are outside of the control of the business, but they impact your ability to succeed in a marketplace. Things like human health and wellness, which is what COVID-19 is part of, global environmental pressures from things like climate change, economic instabilities, political fluctuations, issues with, different oppression dynamics. We've seen a lot of structural inequality perpetrated by things like racism, sexism. All of these different factors are impacting how you bring your business to market and how successful you are. And you know that you're living in an age of accumulated systemic risk when you see, organizations committing to be carbon neutral by 2030, when you see Australian wildfires costing a country's economy 1.2 billion annually, when large portions of workforces are walking out in protest amongst, the message of that overall corporate culture. So there is systemic risk that organizations are continually having to deal with. And I think that this pandemic has really illustrated the role and the importance of systemic risks and how you approach your business going forward. The second area is around automation and collaboration. Now, Forrester's done a lot of research on this over the years. Our research has consistently said 60% of cubicle worker jobs, repetitive manual tasks like accounts payable, other desk-bound jobs, data entry, that type of stuff, is going to be automated by the year 2030, so 60%. However, we do believe that AI, automation, other related technologies have been a little bit overhyped in terms of their impact on general job security. The fact is, for the majority of us, our jobs aren't going to be replaced by AI or machine learning or robots or anything else, but they are going to be transformed. And that'll have a lot of impact on that future of work by creating this new division of labor between humans and automations, whether that is machines, robots, whether that's digital software, where humans must increasingly collaborate directly with those machines and develop new skill sets that leverage their human expertise, such as interacting directly with customers. And of course, this idea of collaboration becomes even more difficult when we start moving toward a world that's a lot more distributed, which is a lot more virtual, and which is working asynchronously. We'll talk a little bit about asynchronous communication a little bit later as well. But this idea of automation and collaboration being major shocks to how we think about the future of work is something that is becoming increasingly clear for a lot of us out there. The third shock is around this idea of employee data tsunami. So we know more about employees than we ever had before, how they feel, how they work, how they're behaving, what their preferences are. And as we go forward into the future of work, that's going to provide the enterprise a lot of opportunity to improve employee experience in key ways by understanding things like, what is that technology experience for that person like? What barriers and challenges do they have with things like devices, applications, authentication, who, when, and why they're collaborating with certain people across the business? Can I optimize that? Can I get them using cloud-based resources in an easier fashion? As well as things like perception around employee engagement experience. So, organizations are increasingly going to use this data. But this whole approach is fraught with risk, right? It poses a much larger risk for organizations. And that's why we consider it a shock, is that there's potential to misuse this. If you think about using it to negatively affect someone's performance or pay at work, there's potential to misunderstand how we use this data. There's potential for leakage and theft of this personally identifiable information, which also poses a major risk for organizations. So a lot of opportunity, but also a lot of risks. And the fourth one, which I think is probably most relevant to this conversation, is this idea of employee power. Now, back in 2015, Forrester had made this shift to what we call the age of the customer. And it was basically around this idea that consumers were using mobile devices and apps and services at a moment's need. Whenever you needed something, you could go and get that. And that was that whole idea of mobile mind shift. We believe something similar is happening with employees right now. They have a lot more options. They have a lot more information from things like Glassdoor about where they can go, what the benefits and challenges are for working at an organization. And so this idea that employees are consistently gaining power, particularly prior to COVID, when there was low unemployment rates, it's a little bit in flux right now, but employees have a lot more power. And your organization needs to sort of think about, how do I respond to that? How do I engage people, give them what they need, discover systemic barriers to success for those employees, and effectively becoming, just like we did in the age of the customer, employee obsessed, not just customer obsessed, employee obsessed as well. So these four shocks, systemic risks, automation, collaboration, employee data tsunami, and employee power, will impact this future of work considerably. It's not just going to be about this virus and how we, roll out, remote work. This is illuminating a lot of other issues. So it's worth noting now, where are we in this whole pandemic, and how have organizations responded? Obviously, remote work has been on the minds of everybody for the past 3 to 4 months. It's been my #1 inquiry topic at Forrester. And I've never been more busy with inquiries about remote work than I have been now. And so obviously a lot of organizations have made this shift to remote work over the past 3 to 4 months. And it's been pretty difficult for a lot of these organizations. And some of that has to do with the fact that remote working just isn't too common in your day-to-day working, prior to COVID. This is some data from our workforce benchmark survey from 2019 that shows which of the following best describes where you primarily work. And this is showing folks that say, I work from home. The highest percentage here that you see from a country perspective is the United States. 7% of US workers say they primarily work from home as their main area, work location. That obviously has changed dramatically. We went back and surveyed some folks in the beginning of May, and these were decision makers, not employees, and said, what percentage of your organization has actually gone working remotely? 47% of respondents we surveyed said that the organization had transitioned to at least 50% of the workforce to home, with a good percentage, transitioning 100%. And even in, industries that you wouldn't think about, financial services, for instance, over 50% of the population works from home at least 50% of the time. And the problem, with this is that it was obviously a tremendous IT challenge. If we go and ask the IT, decision makers, do you think you were actually prepared to handle this heavy remote employee base? 47% of them said, yes, we felt prepared to handle that increase. 36% said, yeah, we were kind of in the middle. We were ready, but there were some other areas that we weren't ready. And 16% saying they did not feel prepared at all. And we saw it in a lot of different areas, whether that was device deployment, VPN configurations, collaboration. One of the big things that came out of this transition was how big of a risk corporate culture was to making this transition. If you couldn't go out and fundamentally trust your employees that weren't under the watchful eye of their manager in the office, really a lot more difficult to make this transition overall. So this was something I thought was pretty interesting in terms of the survey data that we had coming out of this initial transition. And as we look forward here, it's clear that remote working is going to continue, at least to some extent. This was a follow-up question to that same group. Do you anticipate that your organization will permanently maintain a higher rate of full-time remote employees? 48% of them said, yes, we do. 16% of them said, we don't really know. I'd imagine that, probably about half of those do get into that yes category. So at the end of the day, yes, we are looking at more remote working. I don't think that it's 100% remote working. I think more commonly, this is going to be a hybrid model, but the data is very clear that this remote working model is here to stay. And from a lot of the organizations I've worked with, they've actually found that they've been able to work pretty productively in this remote working environment. Obviously, there are caveats to that if you have kids at home, that sort of thing. But a lot of the organizations leaders that I've been talking to have said, actually, this was a good experiment for us because we did realize that we could be, successful in this new model. So definitely this idea of remote working is going to continue. And a lot of that is related to this idea of systemic risk and employee power. It used to be that remote work was all about employee experience benefits, right? Had flexibility, so forth. Now it's part of that systemic risk as well. So one of those 4 shocks, I need to have flexibility, muscle memory around remote working for business continuity reasons. So I think that's one of the major reasons why we are starting to see people accepting that because they can't actually say no. It's not just an EX, it's a business continuity issue as well. So that just gives you a little bit of sense of where we are now, what we're dealing with. What I'd love to do right now is just take a quick break and open this up to the audience for our first poll. We're going to be doing 2 polls throughout this webinar today. So I'm going to transition to our poll here, which is, using your best estimate, what percentage of employees will work remotely at your organization post-pandemic? So let's take a couple minutes here. You can click on the screen and give your answer. I'll give it 30 to 45 seconds for the answers to populate. And then I want to get Loretta's perspective on this as well. Okay, we have the results coming in here. Wow, I think interesting. So 46% said more than 50% of the employees will work from home post-pandemic. 40% said 16 to 25, so about a quarter. Interestingly, 0% of you said 0%. So I'm interested, Loretta, in your take. What do you make of this data?
Right, this is really interesting data, and some of it lines up with some of the discussions that we've been having with customers as well. We're seeing that there's differences in the type of culture companies have. So some are adopting more. And what I find interesting with this data is that there's a pretty big split of more than 50% and then the 16 to 25%. And so we've seen some companies actually adopt remote work wholeheartedly, and then others that are looking at some type of hybrid model. And then we're also seeing that this is consistent no matter what industry. I think you mentioned, Andrew, too. You also saw in the financial industry, financial markets. But also we've been doing some research to take a look at different personas. And then we're seeing that even with the different personas, whether they may be frontline heroes or power users or the regular office workers, that they're all consistently moving more towards remote work. So if we take a look then now from that, what is the impact to the employee? So Andrew, I think what you mentioned about the employee has the power, we're seeing that as well. We're seeing that the employee experience becomes paramount because we're looking at how do we enable the employees to collaborate, to be productive, to innovate, right? Because it's all around how do you unleash some of that innovation and creativity in your workforce. So the whole area of what we're looking at is how do you enable that? And the other thing we're seeing too is that it's IT as well as crews, real estate, facilities, as well as HR, all working together. And it's top level company types of mandates that are happening to really look at the employee experience. Now as we're thrust into this whole remote work, increasing remote work, we're really facing these unprecedented times, right? It's not just being able to work from home, but then there's the factors that are happening with education, online learning. Actually, I have 2 kids, and both of them, they've announced, the school districts, that they're going to be doing 100% online learning beginning in the fall. And so that also puts additional pressures on the employees because in our survey, 56% are concerned about juggling work and supporting their kids while they're at home with online learning. There's also other technology factors as well, where the internet's congested, right? There's competition for resources. You've got maybe 2 spouses that are working, and then you also have you have your kids that are doing online learning. So there's internet congestion. And then also we're seeing that there's increasing insecurity threats. So since the pandemic, there has been a 667% increase in phishing attacks. So all of that puts all these additional pressures on companies on how do they support their remote workers. So that employee, our end users, there's many competing things that are happening, many things happening at once. We're challenged to be productive. We're balancing between the personal and work life. So how do we make this all work? We're all looking at how do we enable this, and we do a lot of consultation with our customers as well on this. So as Andrew mentioned, in terms of a lot of companies not being prepared for this, There's a lot of tech issues that we're also seeing of remote workers at home. And so those include that in our surveys that about 45% weren't fully set up for remote work. And especially for those types of personas like frontline heroes, that call centers, for example, that they may have been more desktop-based or a shared environment-based, and so it was tied to the space. And so now they are thrust to having to do all of that working from home, right? So how do you enable them to have the tools to just even have the basics to be able to connect and to have the compute to be able to do their work? And then there's the increase of security issues. So 88% of companies experience security issues, so pretty significant. Then there's the video calls. Everybody, I mean, even now, even a lot of events are moving towards online. Actually, when the pandemic hit, we had a big internal event that was planned with about over 600, 700 people, bringing in all of the regions across the world. And then that it was planned for 2 weeks later, we turned on a dime to make that event all virtual. And we're seeing a lot of that happening now. So, I mean, just even things like online type of presentations happening in webinars. So there's also, but one of the things that we're looking at is what are some of the long-term systemic changes that are happening. So what we're experiencing on now is not going to be the normal, but where are things going to settle, say, in 6 months, a year from now? So when we did that, and we looked at some of this as well, projecting forward, Fortune also did some where they surveyed their top CEOs, their Fortune 500 CEOs. 51% never expect travel to return to levels before the pandemic, and 52% of IT are planning to increase spend on collaboration. So enabling remote collaboration, enabling those workers at home to be just as productive, just as innovative, collaborating with their colleagues, that's going to be a big focus as we look forward. And then what the center of a lot of this is IT enabling all of that. So we're also seeing that the role of IT is changing. And since COVID, and we've seen some of this as well, and some of as part of my Office of the Future work, we work with a lot of the forward-looking companies throughout the world, and so we've seen this role of IT changing, but this has just accelerated it. And so since COVID, we're seeing IT being more involved in worker engagement, having one-on-one meetings with business units, planning office design with their real estate and facilities counterparts, because not only is it important to understand how the space is going to change, but what are the technologies that are required in those spaces for the workers to be effective. Okay, so I'll hand it back to Andrew as we take a look at the different phases here.
Well, I love that point around technology leaders playing a larger part in the business, Loretta. I think that's an amazing, some stats that you showed there. And we've also seen that as well. We have done work on what we call our Employee Experience Index over the past couple of years. And basically, it's an index that measures employee engagement on a scale of 0 to 100. And we found that of all the factors that contribute to that overall index, 30% of them are actually technology related. So there's actually a direct impact between what technology leaders do and the high level business outcomes that they drive, which is engagement of employees and ultimately, hopefully, retention. The more engaged an employee is, the more likely they are to stay at their company, as well as do other things like recommend the brand or work more positively with customers. So there actually is a direct link between the tech that you provide as a leader in your organization and that business outcome. So I'm not surprised to hear that you're also seeing the same thing. I think it's also worth stepping back and saying, we've been talking about sort of the immediate changes. and transitions that people have made for remote working. But this is part of this larger, phased approach of this pandemic, right? So IT's role is changing as we go through these major phases, which you see on the screen here. We've outlined 4 major phases. There's infection, there was social distancing, management, and eradication. The social distancing, phase is basically what we've been talking about most of the time, which is this period in which IT is playing a leading role in preparing the organization for remote work, getting people up and running, doing all of the sort of heavy lifting around the technology. And as we move to phase 3, depending on your location, where you're at, and your specific business, IT organizations are starting to think a lot more strategically, not just about do people have the tech they need, but how are they being impacted by this long term? Loretta mentioned things like video fatigue. That's definitely something that we've heard a lot about. Being able to collaborate in real time with people and kind of have that whiteboarding experience has been something that a lot of organizations are thinking about trying to do long term as they move into this management phase, where you don't really know when it's going to end, but you need to do something about it. Otherwise, you're going to lose out on the innovation and so forth that we would have in the office. And there are 2 major things that I've seen IT playing a really large role as we've been in this management phase, which is 1, increasingly dedicating a unique staff to digital experience teams. So usually a team of like 2 to 3 people that are in charge of looking at the technology stack of the organization holistically and trying to get an understanding of how is it performing. How is it, failing? What challenges, barriers are people having? And this team is usually working across multiple different teams. So it might be working with your productivity, suite team, with your devices team. Maybe you have a VDI team, a security team, and really looking at, all right, what is the impact of all these tools on overall employee experience and overall engagement? So that has definitely been on the rise, as well as the tools to measure that experience too. So that has definitely been something that has come as part of this pandemic. The second area is that IT plays a really important voice in what we believe will be, the future of work, which is the flexible workplace, the flexible work styles, helping to define those requirements, building those personas like Loretta mentioned, and supporting what I call the 4 imperatives of flexible work, which are structure, culture, technology, and compliance. So IT is going to play a really large role in all of these 4 imperatives. But as you look forward to thinking about what is my long-term strategy for location and flexibility for employees, these are really the 4 key areas that we recommend that you look at. So structure is going to be mostly an HR-led function, but it's going to have some ramifications for IT. So it's things like what roles are going to be working where and when. We see a lot of interest in things like work styles, working full-time at the office, full-time at home, hybrid, flexible hours, even the 4-day work week. Those types of things are pretty much led by HR departments, but are supported from IT as well. If you think about how do I enable people in a very mobile role, I'm not going to go give them a full workstation and ask them to carry it around with their monitor. I'm probably going to give them a lighter weight, more mobile 2-in-1 type of solution, touchscreen enabled maybe. So there's an increasing collaboration between those 2 roles to inform that overall structure. The second area is really around, culture. How do I level the playing field between people that are in the office and at home? And a lot of this, from what I've been talking about with clients, is asynchronous communication styles, defaulting less towards meetings in person and more towards things like team messaging platforms, chat, that sort of thing, and really revamping how we think about communication and collaboration. Of course, there are other elements too. There's a lot of stress, anxiety right now that culture can help ameliorate. A lot of you, I'm sure, have been doing events and whatnot to help people feel engaged. I've heard of companies hiring, psychologists to help with mental health issues if people are, having anxiety from social distancing, paying for things like, food delivery services for parents that don't have time to cook. So there's this long-term strategy around how do I change how I'm collaborating, communicating, but also how do I meet the acute needs of people right now as well. Technology is the third category. Of course, it's incredibly important. It includes, I think a lot of people think about communication and collaboration as the main technologies, but that's not enough, in my opinion. You really need to have a holistic view of that technology. So it's going to include remote access. There's a big discussion right now around, okay, do I go towards BYOD, personally devices? Do I use VDI? Do I have corporate-owned devices? And what's the best way to distribute and manage that access for people? And what I found is it does very much vary on the industry as well as the personas that are using those technologies as well. So call center, for instance, has been a very big, proponent for VDI types of solutions, for example. Security is another big area. Lots of VPN discussions, alternatives to the VPN, using a cloud-based VPN service as opposed to kind of your traditional on-prem, user to full network access VPN, as well as, discussions around hardware. Do I, provide personally owned or corporate owned devices or enable people to use their own? All of these are big discussions that are happening in the industry. And of course, compliance is, obviously a part of the picture. You need to do this legally. And as an IT professional, the key there is, how do I protect the data? How do I ensure that there's boundaries around all of that data so that it's not shared? And at Forrester, we believe that is a zero trust strategy. So if you want to have a flexible work style going forward, you really do need to think about these 4 key imperatives and make sure that you're zeroing in on it. And we have a report that we just published, which goes into a lot of detail on this as well. The good thing is that a lot of companies have some prior art here in terms of succeeding with flexible work. These are 3 examples of companies that have flexible work for the last 10 to 15 years, maybe even a little bit more than that. There was a large US-based call center that moved to flexible work for this workforce, and they actually found they reduced their attrition rates by 90%, which in a call center is absolutely massive, right? And they actually expanded their overall experience level by 10 years. Because they were able to hire people that wanted to work in a flexible manner, as opposed to having people with average years of 10 years experience or 2 years experience, They were now hiring people with 12 years experience. So a lot of business benefits there. Humana is another example. You have a company that has flexible work styles. If you look them up, you'll see they've been recognized for flexible working for the past 7 years by a variety of organizations. They have a bunch of different work styles for different working types as well. And a lot of them are enabled by certain technologies. So it's a good example of how IT and HR works together to provide the best solution for those workers. USAA is another example of a company that has been recognized for flexible work styles. They've been able to increase retention. My conversations with them, which I published in some research, no drop in productivity based off the surveys that they're doing as well. So there are examples of companies that are doing this. You just have to look and try to look for that prior art that's out there. So we've talked a lot about technology and some of those changes, a little bit about culture. I think it's worth just spending a few minutes on overall culture changes as well. If you really want to make this successful, a lot of the organizations that have struggled with this have been traditionally office-based, a little bit more conservative in their cultures overall. And we see a couple of major shifts here. One is between how do you measure productivity? The traditional way is looking at tasks, right? How many tasks do I complete every single day? And what we're seeing now is a shift towards outcome-based cultures, where I start looking at, okay, what is the agreed upon thing that me and my manager have agreed upon brings the best value to my business? And do I hit that thing? How quickly can I do it? How much value does it have? So it's about that outcome, not how much time I spend, emailing people and being at my computer. Directive top-down leadership moving to servant leadership, right? This is a big discussion. I have a lot of client inquiries where the people come to me and say, are there any tools for me to measure productivity? And my answer to that is that's the wrong question. You need to be looking at how can the manager facilitate productivity and remove barriers or challenges that are in that employee's way. It really is about that one-to-one relationship between the employee and the manager in terms of how this is organized. So we're seeing a lot more organizations investing in leadership training as a result of this. I've talked to a number of them that have specifically because of COVID-19 invested in leadership training, and it's for this reason, so that they can go in a distributed workforce and not feel like they have to worry about whether people are being productive. Synchronous communication, high meeting volume, to asynchronous, emphasis on persistent chat communications. I talked a little bit about this, but it's essentially this idea that you're relying less on face-to-face. You're giving people more flexibility in terms of when to respond, and you're preserving that context within chat channels or whatever type of content communication platform that you have in place. So there's definitely a sea change in terms of how people collaborate and communicate. In the past, it was also this idea that office for all activities. I would come in, I would do my heads down work, I would do my collaborative work, I would do my one-on-ones with my manager, I would meet with customers there. From what I've been talking about with customers, they're really starting to think about the office in a different way. This is the place where you go to build relationships. It's not the place where you go to sit down, in my case, and write a Forrester report for 8 hours or build a deck or something like that. It is a place where you try to benefit from face-to-face collaboration, from meetings, from having customer presentations, that sort of thing. So a lot of organizations are moving towards hot desking solutions where there are no assigned seats, and they're trying to reduce that overall real estate size, because they realize that the traditional office, as it was, doesn't really fit the mold for productivity. And they found that a lot of people can be more productive at home. Obviously, there are some caveats to that if you have kids and whatnot at home, but that has been a major shift as well. And I think, finally, and one that I'm personally very happy about, is this shift, I think, from kind of this stoic corporate, culture, where we didn't necessarily talk about the challenges that people were having, managing, being a parent, being an educator, being a cook, being an employee, all at the same time. And we were afraid to have those conversations. I'm finding a lot more organizations are being much more empathetic. And I think the organizations that do have that empathy now are going to reap those long-term benefits. You remember that the human brain is hardwired to remember negative events. So if you're in a situation now where you feel your organization is less empathetic towards employees than you think they may otherwise should be, that's going to stick in their minds for years to come. And so I think this idea of empathy and being much more open about the challenges that people have realistically at home and at work is going to be something that is a positive that comes out of this future of work. So I want to switch to our next poll question here, and then I'll switch it over to Loretta. She has some really awesome data to show as well. So we'll pull up the next poll question here, which is, in your opinion, what will be the biggest challenge for your organization in the new normal? Will it be keeping employees safe and secure, leveling the playing field, fostering inclusion, engagement, maintaining a good tech experience, ensuring employees feel comfortable returning to the office? So I'll give you a couple, half minute or so to respond with your answers. I'll read them off, and then same as last time, I'd love to get Loretta's opinion on what's her interpretation of this. Okay, a couple more seconds here, and then we'll read off the answers. All right, let's cut off our poll here and read out the answers. pretty interesting results. I think people have different opinions about what will be the biggest challenge. I think the highest one here is maintaining a good tech experience. But there's also about level, interest in terms of inclusion, leveling the playing field, comfortable returning to work. So pretty interesting, even split across here. Loretta, what do you make of this?
Yeah, it's interesting, and actually some of it's related, right? So maintaining a good tech experience is related a bit to leveling the playing field between office and remote. So it's I find that this is interesting that it's not anything that comes to the very top. It's very, very split. I mean, Andrew, your thoughts as well? Is this what you expected?
I would say that the most that I hear about is the inclusion and engagement for the remote employees. So I'm a little bit surprised that every single one here is actually pretty high. It's pretty even split. So yeah, I think I'm surprised at just how evenly it split is. But I think overall it does show that everybody on this call is thinking about this broadly, I think, which is a good thing.
Right. So we had also done some research because we surveyed both the IT decision maker and then also the end user, and we were surprised at the split in the answers, right? Because we've been doing a lot of research, with the IT decision makers on trying to understand what the shifts were in terms of work from home all the time versus work from home sometimes and then working in the office. And when we compared this to maybe 6, 8, 10 months ago before the pandemic, there was definitely a shift to more work from home. And Andrew, as you mentioned, there's differences between work from home 100% of the time versus work from home some of the times. So we saw increases on both. But then if you take a look on the right side, we did the same question to the end users. And what this reinforces is what you were just saying in terms of employees want flexibility. So they so overwhelmingly work from home some of the times was larger because they want the ability to work from home when they need to, but then come into the office when they need to. And we see that role of the office is changing. So some of the other research that we looked at too was understanding what that home environment is. And this actually is different when you look at different markets too. So because size of houses, size of apartments are different. But when we aggregated it worldwide, we looked at, okay, where are people working in home? And only 46% actually had a dedicated home workspace. Whether it's a dedicated home office. So I'm fortunate to actually have a separate office, but many people, like one of my team members, has just a desk in the kitchen. And then people are working everywhere, right? Living room, dining room, bedroom, kitchen. The other piece that was kind of interesting out of this research as well is that there's some multi-generational differences. Like, for example, in China, there's a pretty significant number of workers who had people who were over, 70 and then who were under 17, right? So there's like 3 generations in the workforce in a space that is much smaller than the average space here in the United States. So as we think about our employees, we have to think about all that circumstances. It's a much more heterogeneous environment. It's very different than planning for in the office. So in HP, we've been looking a lot at how do we design for home and how is that different. Now, the fortunate thing, though, is that both end users and IT feel like we're collaborating a lot better than expected. So that's good news. The end users, the employees are learning how to use collaboration tools better. I think one of the factors before the pandemic of why people weren't working from remotely 100% of the time was whether, and kind of to your point, Andrew, of whether you can have that consistent experience of being in the office and at home. And I think that's one of the big barriers that is being broken through all of this work of everybody working from home. Now, the other piece, though, is that there is and I think we saw that in that survey of difference between IT decision makers and end user view, that there's still a sense of a feeling of that the office offers something that they don't get at home. There's a bit more of feeling of isolation when you don't have all your colleagues around. And so people want to come back in the office so that they can feel connected to their company and they can learn more about what's going on. They have their friends in the office. There's the whole piece of ad hoc collisions so that they can collaborate, co-create better together. But when people come back into the office, there's going to be some changes, right? So in the short term, when the first wave comes back, and there's differences between markets, right? EMEA has more of their employees that are back in the office versus at home, but that first wave who comes back is going to be more around configuring the spaces, adding division, less shared environments, having the cleaning being much more visible. But then as we look forward in terms of what is the impact in how is this changing how offices will be designed. So more virtual video collaboration on all spaces, because one of the things that we're seeing too is that the role of the office will change more to being a place for building community, for people to collaborate. And so offices are going to be designing for that in mind and be more adaptable so that in the future spaces and furniture can change dynamically to enable that collaboration and sense of community. There'll be more sensors, so smarter offices for sensing occupancy, helping with the productivity and even well-being in some cases, right? Being able to measure density in offices, whether social distancing is happening. And then also materials. So the different materials that are being leveraged will definitely look and also on our PCs too. We're fortunate that we have aluminum-based PCs that have a coating that can be sanitized more than anybody else, and so that's carrying into the office in terms of looking at those types of materials that are being in the office, especially that are shared and being touched, and then just new norms. So how do you build that technology? So to that point, Andrew and I were talking about earlier, to build that community and bridge that distance between the office and home. Now, when we take a look at technology being the foundation of this, we're seeing that about 44% of ITDMs are planning to increase spend overall for the year. So they're finding that the remote worker doesn't have necessarily all the tools that they need to be productive, and actually one of the feedbacks that we had gotten from the actually end user survey is that many employees feel that they need more compute, a more powerful PC. And so there's even just some fundamental things that need to happen in order for them to be as productive working, no matter at home or in office. Now, we also looked at what technologies have accelerated. And what we're seeing companies evaluating are technologies around collaboration. So how do you enable people to collaborate better no matter where they are? Cloud-based access, and so this includes cloud clients, VDI, and then also automation, and that was one of the big shocks that Andrew had mentioned. So automating those manual processes, chatbots so even like for employee support, how do you have chatbots so that customers or employees can get access to information faster? And then around connectivity. So one of the interesting things here is that we have LTE on our PCs, and it was meant to be for the mobile trailblazers, people who are on the road a lot, but our LTE attached has actually increased during the pandemic. which is interesting because the pandemic is when everybody's working from home. But employees in IT are looking at how do you enable those remote workforce to be just as connected working from home as anywhere. And so that's why LTE has become even a key factor, not just for the mobile trailblazer. So Andrew, how does that kind of fit with what you see in terms of some of the technologies and processes that you...
It very much aligns with what we've seen at Forrester. We looked at folks that increased investment as a result of the pandemic. What types of technologies? The top 3 categories were information security, number 1, cloud infrastructure, and mobility as being the top 3, where if people were expanding investment, not everybody was. Those are the 3 types of technologies. But there's a lot of things that you hit on there that I think that I've seen. Certainly the automation of the processes. You see device deployment and management here. We've seen a lot more interest in things like modern management. Can I go to the factory of my hardware provider and have them drop ship a PC directly to an employee, using modern management APIs to do that as opposed to kind of traditional management methods. So there's a bit of automation that occurs there. End user experience management tools was something that I've seen a little bit more. I touched on it earlier with the digital experience teams, but these tools essentially track end user experience, look at degradations in performance, that sort of thing. So I've definitely seen elements there. Zero Trust Network Access as a replacement for VPN. So this is cloud-based access to an application on a per user basis. So rather than going per user to network, full network, you're going user to application and doing it through the cloud. Alternatives to kind of your traditional VPN. VDI you mentioned as well. I'm seeing increases in cloud-based desktop virtualization as well. Trying to give people remote access. Passwordless authentication has been something that has been high on the list of a lot of organizations as they've struggled with resetting passwords that rely on domain join connectivity for people working from home. Virtual worlds and collaboration solutions. So things that mimic that physical experience of being in the workplace in the digital world. There's a couple of different solutions out there. What'll provide a digital whiteboard that I can video conference in. I can bring files in. I can do sticky notes. That sort of thing has been an area that, particularly in the last, I would say, 2 to 3 weeks, has been really high on a list of people as they've kind of gone into this management phase. So I would say there's a lot of different technologies that people are looking at depending on how they've fared throughout the other phases of the pandemic. But certainly we do see some trends, and I would echo that they are very similar to the ones that Loretta mentioned here. So I think we're going to wrap up this portion and actually open up the Q&A portion of this webinar here. And let's see, we'll take a look and see if we have questions here.
Great, thanks, Andrew. And there's actually a number of questions that are in the QA. So just a reminder to everybody, just add your Q&A. So there's a Q&A button to log a question. And if we don't answer it during this time, we can answer it offline too. So one of the questions that has been coming up, Andrew, is around this measuring of productivity. And I get this question quite a bit. And so during when you were talking through, you were saying moving to more outcome-based. Can you give some examples of what some of those outcomes could be?
Yeah, so let's say, for a knowledge worker, it's very hard to measure productivity, right? Because, the units of, cognitive, work that are required for a certain thing will vary, depending on if I'm writing something or I'm giving a presentation or something like that. So productivity itself is kind of a misnomer when it comes to knowledge workers. So the way that you look at sort of outcome-based is, one, to start with that one-to-one manager relationship. So an example of that would be, I would, have a meeting with my manager. We would discuss, okay, here are our goals for the quarter that we'd really love to accomplish. Okay, we're going to agree on that ahead of time. And we'll have a set check-in where we're actually going to look at that. at the end of that 3-month period, right? So it starts with that one-to-one management, relationship. And then it's about having those weekly or bi-weekly check-ins where you're actually looking and meeting with that person and understanding what challenges do they have, how do they need support. But it is that mutual agreement between both parties that, yes, I will deliver this at this time. You can goal me on this specific piece. And then that specific business outcome will be different based off of whatever that person's role is. So, in a call center environment or in a trading environment where the outcome is literally how many calls you take or how many trades you make, it's very easy to measure. But from, more of a salesperson perspective, you might be looking at not just how many sales were completed, but what were the volume of those sales. So you need to look at it on a role-by-role basis and start building those outcomes and agreeing upon them up front if you really want to measure whether someone's being successful or not.
Great. Thanks, Andrew. So another question around whether we have any insights on the customer needs at home, what pops to the top, and then also what about ergonomics? So let me start, and then Andrew, you can add, because this was one of the big questions that we also were trying to understand from our end users. And so the top items that came to the top, as I mentioned, was more powerful compute, and also internet connectivity was the other piece. So we're seeing companies supplying maybe better connectivity options for their employees. So it's back to the basics. Right. But then there were other things. So those scored higher than ergonomics around space, dedicated space at home, even, soundproofing, things like that. But once we get through the basics, one thing that's been popping up a little bit more is around ergonomics. In fact, HP has a stipend. So we had announced a stipend to all of our employees of $250 that they could spend on a chair or display. And so we're hearing that a little bit more from our companies that we talk to as well. So Andrew, is this consistent with what you hear or anything different?
Yeah, I would say the majority of companies I talk with, when they're supporting employees, will start with the internet connectivity. Almost every organization I've talked with is giving some reimbursements, usually like $30 to $50. Per month for some reimbursement of that. Might be more if they are using like a VDI and they really require that high connectivity to access, a GPU accelerated, cloud-based workstation or something like that. But generally that does tend to be the top one. We have seen, the ergonomics piece be important too. And particularly in certain countries, like in the UK, for instance, you have, certain compliance features around workplace safety. And, if you're in a home office environment and you end up developing carpal tunnel syndrome, you're open to liability. So there are some instances of that where the ergonomics become really important from a compliance perspective as well. But I would agree mostly. Okay,
great. Okay, so probably we'll probably have time just for one other questions. So there's a question about work, personal devices and employee issued devices. So what are we seeing in terms of policies around that? And Andrew, you want to start there?
Sure. I've seen, it's been mixed. I think a lot of people are interested in BYOD because they think about the cost savings of not having to provision the hardware, but you're also, opening up yourself to potential security risks too, depending on what those devices are. So I would say in sort of the less regulated industries like professional services or high tech, I do see some more personally owned devices if you can manage it using, an MDM provider or something like that. You can have a certificate and do device health checks and so forth. But in the more regulated industries, that's really only something that happens when there's virtualization. I think most companies out there, if they're in a regulated industry specifically, are looking at corporate-owned devices. So I do see interest in both, but there's a split based off the industries.
Right. And we're actually seeing that increasingly IT is looking at how do they look to manage all these devices, right? So having it more come under the IT umbrella. so that because security is probably one of the top issues that's coming out with people working from home. So we're seeing an increasing trend. I think the BYOD piece was people were trying to solve for an issue, but I think over time that we'll see IT having a stronger play there. Okay, so I think we are out of time. So why don't we go ahead? So any questions that we didn't answer, we'll answer offline, and we'll turn this back to Abby.
Thank you, Andrew and Loretta. Great conversation on the Office of the Future Trends. Thank you very much.